Good morning. What's in your wallet? Not much. What's in your wallet? I'm not asking for another contribution this morning, or asking you to give more than what you did, but simply to remind you, we have all seen the "What's in your wallet" commercials. All of us have seen it. The purpose of that commercial, very simply, is to try to convince you and I as consumer that in order to have the type of life that we want to have, we've got to have that Capital One credit card in our wallet. And we've got to use it. And you know what? It's a very simple question, and yet it provides a very valuable service, and really it's pretty useful commercial. I want to ask a very simple question here this morning. And I thought of that commercial as I was working on the things I wanted to say today. I thought about that commercial. But I want to ask a very simple question here this morning, and the answer to that question is important because the way in which you answer it gives a pretty good indication of what the people of the world think of us, or think about you, or think about the church. I want to ask the question, what type of life are you living? That's a simple question. And yet, the answer that we give will determine to each of us what the people of the world think about us, simply based upon the way in which we live our life. Now, friends, think about that question. Think about, how does the world see you? As you're walking down the street, whether it be in Marietta or in Walmart or something of that nature, whether you're taking a walk here on 821, what do your neighbors think about you? When they see you, do they say, well, there goes Kevin King. He's a good Christian man. I know that because he's living the way he teaches. He's a good Christian man. And he's a member at Lower Paw Paw, and so I bet all of those people are good people. Do they think that? Or as you're walking down the street, does your neighbor think, well, there goes Clint Miller. He is a hypocrite. He says one thing, but he lives the other thing. So I know he's a hypocrite. He is a member at that Lower Paw Paw Church of Christ, and I bet they're all a group of hypocrites. Now somebody might say, well, Tom, that's a pretty harsh thing to say. But when you stop and you think about it, isn't that exactly the way the world thinks? Isn't that the way the world thinks? When they look at us and they see us to be hypocrites because we're simply not living the way we say that we should be living, do they not think about that or think that of the whole group? Well, Tom, it's not true. Well, no, it may not be true, but yet that's exactly the way the people of the world think. So what type of life are you living? What type of life are you living? Let's just say that you are someone who is not living the type of life that you proclaim to be living. Who do we dishonor? Well, Tom, that's an easy answer. That's an easy question to answer. If we're not living the way we say we're supposed to be living, we dishonor ourselves. And that person who is living the opposite way dishonors all of us. And that's true. But let's look in the bigger picture. Who else do we dishonor? Well, friends, if we are living the opposite of what we say we should be living, or living the opposite of what we teach we need to be living, if we're living the opposite way, we're dishonoring God. In fact, friends, that's exactly what the Jews did in the eyes of the Gentiles. They dishonored God. Turn to Romans chapter 2. Romans chapter 2. And let's notice what the apostle has to teach beginning in verse 17 of this passage. Romans chapter 2. Many of you who are with us on a Wednesday night will recognize this and remember the things that we had to say at that time. But we want to encourage others who may not be a part of our class to come and to be a part of it. But Romans chapter 2. Let's begin in verse 17. And I'll be reading from the King James Version of the Bible today. Beginning in verse 17. Behold, thou art called a Jew, and restest in the law, and makest thy boast of God, and knowest his will, and approvest the things that are more excellent, being instructed out of the law. Thou art confident that thyself art a guide of the blind, a light off to them that are in darkness, an instructor of the foolish, teacher of babes. What has the form of knowledge and of truth in the law? Thou therefore which teachest another, teachest thou thyself? Thou that preachest a man should not steal, dost thou steal? Thou that sayest a man should not commit adultery, dost thou commit adultery? Thou that abhorrest idols, dost thou commit sacrilege? Thou that makest thy boast of the law, through the breaking of the law dishonorest thou God? For the name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles through you. For the name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles through you. You know, the Jews at this particular time, they believed that they were far better than anyone else. They believed that they were better than anyone else in the Gentile world. They said, we're the children of Abraham. We're better. We had the law, and therefore we are better. We have the law, that only proves that we are God's favorites. And not only did they have the law, but they had a knowledge of the law. They had been, as we're told in verse 18, they had a knowledge of the things that were more excellent, being instructed out of the law. And so the Jews saw this as, well, I have that knowledge. I've been instructed. That only makes it possible for me to teach everybody else. That makes it possible for me to teach the Gentiles. In fact, that's the idea that's being presented here in verses 19 and 20. And art confident that thou thyself art a guide of the blind, and a light of them which are in darkness, an instructor of the foolish, a teacher of babes. They thought since they had a knowledge of the law, had been instructed in the law, then they can teach the Gentiles the law. But there was one problem with that. Yes, they had the law, and they had a knowledge of it, but they did not obey it. That was the problem. They did not obey it. In fact, that is the very thing that Paul is trying to get across in verses 21 and 22. Thou therefore that teachest another, teachest thou not thyself? Thou that preachest a man should not steal, dost thou not steal? Thou that sayest a man should not commit adultery, dost thou commit adultery? Those that abhor idols, dost thou commit sacrilege? Okay, you have the knowledge, you've been instructed, but are you living what you are teaching? You are teaching that it is wrong to steal, but yet you are stealing. You teach that it is wrong to commit adultery, but yet you're committing adultery. They were not living the type of life that they said they were living. They were not living it. And therefore, they were dishonoring God. Well, Tom, you don't have to worry about that. You see, the Jews, they were God's favorites. The Jews were the children of Abraham. The Jews had the law of Moses. God was going to overlook everything they did because they were God's favorites. Well, you see, Paul here is teaching that's not right. That is not right. In fact, God, in verse 6 of chapter 2, is going to render unto every man, whether he be Jew or Gentile, is going to render every man judgment according to his deeds. So just the fact that you have the law, that you're a child of God, does not mean God is going to overlook your disobedience. Let's go back to chapter 2. And let's read here now, beginning in verse 1. Therefore thou art inexcusable, O man, whoever thou art that judgest. For wherein thou judgest another, thou condemnest thyself. Thou that judgest doest the same things. But we are sure that the judgment of God is according to truth against them which commit such things. And thinkest thou this, O man, that judgest them which do such things, and doest the same, that thou shalt escape the judgment of God? Or despisest thou the riches of his goodness and forbearance and longsuffering, not knowing that the goodness of God leadeth thee to repentance? But after thy hardness and unpenitent heart treasureth up to thyself wrath against the day of wrath, and revelation of the righteous judgment of God, who will render to every man according to his deeds. To them who by patient continuance in well-doing, seeking for glory and honor and immortality, eternal life. But unto them that are contentious, and do not obey the truth, but obey unrighteousness, indignation and wrath, tribulation and anguish upon every soul that doeth evil, of the Jew first, and also of the Gentile. You're not going to get away with not living the way you should be living. But glory and honor and peace to every man that worketh good, to the Jew first and also to the Gentile. For there is no respect of persons with God. For as many as have sinned without the law shall also perish without the law. And as many have sinned in the law shall be judged by the law. For not the hearers of the law are just before God, but the doers of the law shall be justified. Only those who obey, who live the things that they say they are supposed to be living according to, only they will be declared innocent by God. Only those who obey. The Jews were not obeying. And they thought and they believed that they were going to be overlooked, that those wrongs would be overlooked, that they would still be saved. But Paul said here that's not the case. God's going to render to every man according to his deeds. Friends, the same thing is true with you and I today. If we are someone who is not living the way that we need to be living, if we're not obeying the commandments of Jesus Christ, if we're not living according to the gospel, we're going to be judged according to those deeds. If we're not living according to the gospel, we're only bringing dishonor upon ourselves, dishonor upon the church, and dishonor upon God. You see, if we are living the opposite of what we teach we should be living, people are going to speak evil of God. They're going to speak contempt against God. They're going to revile against God, which, by the way, is exactly what the word blaspheme means in verse 24. For the name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles through you. Blaspheme means to speak reproachfully, to speak evil of, to revile, to speak contemptuous of. And so, friends, if we are living the opposite of what we teach, the opposite of what we say we need to be living, then we're only bringing reproach upon God. And so the question is, what type of life are you living? Won't you come this morning? If you're not living the type of life that is taught by Christ, if you're not living the type of life that is according to the gospel, if you're not living the type of life that has been commanded by God, if you're not living your faith, you're bringing dishonor upon yourself, upon the church, upon God. Won't you make things right and begin now to live the way you need to be living? If you're outside of Christ and you have disobeyed the gospel or not haven't obeyed the gospel at all, won't you come this morning? Won't you come right now? While together we stand and we sing.